Welcome to Oriental Journeys Podcast, a podcast inspired by the travels and writing of the legendary traveler Ibn Battuta. My name is Ray Behboudi, your host today. This podcast is produced in partnership with Monash University. Ibn Battuta, one of the most noted explorers of the medieval world, narrated a series of first-hand observations on the destinations he reached over almost 30 years of travels in 14th century. This Moroccan traveler passed through an astonishing extent of places, encountering diverse people. His observations, experiences, and encounters tell us a lot about what life was like in medieval time, with fascinating relevance to now. Guided and inspired by Ibn Battuta's footsteps, this podcast opens a portal into the world of the East for people who are curious about the past, hungry for the marvels of traveling, and contemplate the wonders of cities. Accompany us over our journeys into the distant, unfamiliar, and unknown. In this episode, we sit on another online conversation to explore Ibn Battuta's traveling and search to find out more about him and his travels with Tim Mackintosh-Smith. Tim is a British Oxford-educated Arabist, writer, traveler, translator and lecturer, based in Yemen for many decades but currently nomadic. He is one of the foremost scholars of the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta. Mackintosh-Smith has published a trilogy recounting his journeys in the footnotes of Ibn Battuta, Travels with A Tangerine, The Hall of 1,000 Columns, and Landfalls. In 2007, Tim presented a major BBC documentary series, Travels with a Tangerine, recounting his experiences tracing Ibn Battuta's 14th-century travels in the present day. In 2016, he also published an edited abridgement of Travels of Ibn Battuta with Macmillan Collector's Library. Hello and welcome, Tim.
It's good to be back. I think a famous Arabic poet said, I can't remember which one now, but he said, the worst thing about traveling is saying goodbye. So I didn't have to say goodbye after our first meeting. It's good to be back.
Yeah, happy to have you again. To continue our conversation from the last episode, I would like to ask a question on Yemen. You are from a British background and have lived in Yemen in a tower house in Sana'a. Presumably you know the country very well. And we know that Ibn Battuta has also visited Yemen and wrote about his observations there. Does any of his accounts resonate with your experiences, and what do you like most about his descriptions on beautiful Yemen?
Well, it's interesting. It's an interesting question because it makes me think what Ibn Battuta's priorities were. And you say beautiful Yemen, and it is beautiful. I mean, to me, it's actually the most beautiful country on earth, and it's. All right, that's a personal opinion. I think even objectively, it must be among the most beautiful countries in the Arab world, and certainly among the most interesting. Its beauties to us today are probably things that did not interest Ibn Battuta so much. He was more interested in people, and he is throughout his book. And he does describe landscape. He describes. He tends to describe landscape when it kind of obstructs him. When the sea becomes stormy, or where mountains are difficult to cross, or where he gets stuck in the sort of bush in India and other places. Buildings and monuments he describes pretty well, but his main interest is always in people, and this is what resonated with me, and it's another story about my becoming interested in him, because while I was reading his book for the first time, there was a knock on my door, and this old friend of mine came around, Dr. Hassan, and he came up and said, "Oh, what are you reading?" And I was reading Ibn Battuta about Yemen, about how he stayed he was a guest of the Sultan there, who was called Sultan al-Mujahid. And Hassan said, "Oh, you know who this is?" And I said, "Yeah, he was the Sultan of Yemen, al-Mujahid." Now, Hassan's family name, their original family name, is al-Mujahid. And I hadn't realized that they were descended from the Sultan that Ibn Battuta was staying with. And I kind of looked at Hassan and looked at the page in the book, and it was another of these connections across time when you're meeting a descendant. And that's really what resonated. He is again the direct descendant of somebody in this book. And it was actually that, I think it was that was a very important moment in setting me off looking for other resonances, and particularly resonances among people.
What a coincidence of meeting with a descendant of Sultan Mujahid while you were reading that very certain section about him in the book. It sounds very interesting.
Well, you say coincidence, but in a sense, is anything a coincidence? I don't know. I think if you believe in God, as Ibn Battuta did very, very strongly, then sort of nothing is a coincidence. It's all, it's all there in the mind of God. I like to think of it as I was writing something about something completely different, which had some very unexpected coincidences. And I said, well, perhaps it's just that we're all in a pattern, but it's too big for us to make it out. Yeah. And thinking about coincidence and so on, it just strikes me that it's all a bit like was it Henry James who talked about the pattern and the carpet, and my mind immediately leaps to the beautiful carpets of your native country. He leaps also to the verse from the Quran about God rolling out. I think it says something like, he rolled out the earth as a carpet. So we're all sort of searching for the pattern of the carpet.
This is a beautiful analogy. At this point, Tim, I would like to move on from your personal connections with Ibn Battuta to your perspectives on his word. Can you let me know what makes Ibn Battuta and his travels special, and how valuable is it as an historic source, and why?
Yeah, I mean, with anything like this, it is so big that I have to home in on details, or sort of general themes. And it is special because it's a witness to history, politics, geography, architecture, belief, so many different aspects of life. It's like a kind of slice through time. As you say, it is a very valuable historical source. And in a sense, Ibn Battuta was a historian despite himself, and he was a geographer despite himself. He didn't set out to be a geographer, but he gives us loads of geography. He does actually overtly give us history at times. He gives us a history of Delhi, bits in other places. But it's almost the history by chance that you get in it, which is so useful. And there are many, many parts of his travels which we wouldn't actually know a lot about were it not for the travels. And I mentioned the Empire of Mali, bits of Central Asia, Sri Lanka at the time, the situation in southern China. It's a long, long list. The Maldives that I've talked about, and we really wouldn't know much about a lot of these places at the time were it not for Ibn Battuta's travels. And well, if I give you one example from the Maldives, he talks about the situation in the ruling family and the politics of the time that we don't really get in the as far as I know, the one history of the Maldives that talks about that time. And you might say, well, it's only one man's view, and he might have misremembered things because he was having to remember years later, and he lost his notes if he had any. But in the Maldives, there's one case where we can actually check up on him. He quotes an inscription from the main mosque in Male, the capital, which talks about its foundation and so on. He quotes it in his book. This very inscription that he saw has survived. He remembered the text. He got the name of the founder a bit wrong, but it was a strange, a non-Arabic name. But otherwise, the text is sound, detailed. So, as a historical observer, he can be very, very exact. There are bits where there are probably what you would call interpolations in his travels, where I'd like to blame it on Ibn Juzay, that he's added bits, where he claims that Ibn Battuta went to Khan Balak, which is Beijing these days, and I don't think he did. But generally speaking, it's a really precious historical source.
Interesting. Your remarks on the precision of Ibn Battuta observations makes me think how the Travels has been written. Ibn Battuta was not taking notes, as I know, on a regular basis, and almost all of the travels recounted by him based on his extraordinary memory when he got back to Morocco after almost 30 years of traveling. Am I right?
Yeah, and of course, he did occasionally take notes. He mentions taking notes at I think it was a cemetery somewhere in Central Asia, and he wrote down some inscriptions. And then he says, but my records were lost with everything else I lost when I was attacked by the pirates off the coast of India. So he really, as far as we know, he didn't come back with much in the way of notes, if anything. But he had this amazing memory. But then people did have better memories in those days. They didn't have Google on their phones. They memorized the Quran and everything else. So their memory muscles were very strong. At the same time, Ibn Battuta didn't know that I would come and check on him. Sometimes he fails, like with the elephants, but very often, in fact, more often than not, he passes the test with flying colours.
So you're saying that Ibn Battuta's records have been verified into a large extent?
Yeah, but people have doubted whether he went to China at all. But, he mentions the guy he stayed with in Zaytun, which is Quanzhou in Fujian province. And, he wasn't a person otherwise known. But I found, or was rather taken to, because it was in Chinese, an inscription which mentioned this very, very person that he stayed with.
Thank you so much, Tim, for your great highlights on the value of the Travels as a historic source. I know that you probably have heaps more to add into this list, but for now we've got a good snapshot of why the Travels of Ibn Battuta is so significant from a historic point of view. When we consider the historic context of the Travels, and when those adventures have happened, it was just before colonization. What do Ibn Battuta observations tell us about and tell you about the pre-colonization era in Darul Islam, which are lands ruled by Muslim kings and princes and lived by Muslims dominantly?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this, because what comes across is a picture of not a globalized world, but a kind of semi or hemi-globalized world. I think that's another word that I owe to Ross Dunn. Everything was very, very interconnected. Of course, communications took longer than they do these days, but the connections across this world, or this half world, Eurasia and Africa, effectively, and the great watery basins of the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. The connections were very, very close. They were somehow, how can I put it, they were organic. They kind of grew up out of themselves, rather than being imposed from outside, as happened in the colonial period, when you had the Portuguese storming into the Indian Ocean and trying to control the whole place for themselves. So before that, everything was atomized, but the atoms were all connecting. and intercommunicating. Well, to give you a sort of concrete example, I thought of a good one. When Ibn Battuta's in Delhi, he bumps into this guy and he says, "I know you." And the guy says, "And I know you." And it turns out that the man is, he's called al-Bushri, and he came from Sabta, which is now the Ceuta, that Spanish enclave in Morocco. But it's, it's sort of 30 kilometers up the road from Ibn Battuta's Tangier. And, they knew each other back home in Morocco, and here they are bumping into each other in Delhi, which is remarkable in itself, given the date, but, not completely unique. But then Ibn Battuta later on, he's in China, and he bumps into him again in China, the same man. And then much later on his Saharan journey, he's in a place called Sijil Masa, in the sort of far south of Morocco on the edge of the Sahara. And he ends up staying with al-Bushri's brother. He says, here's somebody in Morocco, there's somebody in China who he's already met in Delhi. And he says, "Oh, how far apart the two of them were." Kind of the understatement of the book. I love that phrase, how far apart they were. But in a sense, the fact that he met them, it brings it all together. So this interconnectedness. Yeah. And also, I would say, you use the phrase Dar al-Islam. It also tends to make me think that it's rather a kind of jurist's concept, or you might say a jurist and orientalist concept, because it's a neat thing to think of Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb, the region of the war outside the Islamic territories, and as if they're two kind of things that don't meet. But they definitely do in Battuta's travels.
In that sense, so there were more organic connections between these two words, rather than we label it today as Darul Islam or Darul Harb, equivalent to Muslim and non-Muslim words. Am I right?
Well, this is it. The organic nature actually spilled over outside the Darul Islam. And to give one example, I always like to think of a concrete example. Ibn Battuta finds himself in Hangzhou in China, southeast China, and there's the famous West Lake. It comes up in all these old Chinese pictures, the beautiful lake scene with the boats. And he's witnessing a sort of party on the lake where they have dragon boats. They still have them there. I went in one. And singing. He's listening to Saadi on a lake in China, of course, under the Mongol Yuan dynasty. So technically it was beyond the Dar al-Islam.
Oh, you picked a very nice example, Tim. And I like this verse, which was recited by the Chinese sailors in those luxurious dragon boats on an occasion which seemed to be a lake party. As you said, the verse is from Saadi, who is one of the greatest poets of Persian classic literature. I will recite the original verse in Persian. Maybe it might be interesting for audiences. And the verse is: تا دل به مهرت داده ام در بحر غم افتاده ام چون در نماز استاده ام گویی به محراب اندری. Which roughly means, since I have fallen in love with you, I have fallen in the seas of sorrows. As I stand up to say my prayer, it feels like I can see you have settled in the altar already. I think this is a beautiful verse.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, truly brilliant. And now, Tim, getting back to our main topic, I don't want to put anything in your mouth, but as we know, the word has gone through massive transformations during colonization period. Have you ever thought that the word landscapes, including cultural, social, and geographical ones, were more authentic period to colonization era?
Well, I think history is a series of transformations, massive or less massive. And obviously the spread of Islam, it transformed a lot in its own day. So, it was, and of course it still is in a huge part of the world, a sort of super culture. So, we're at the moment we're in a time of transformation where, all right, I suppose you could say that the United States has been driving this in recent decades. European colonial movements have been doing that before, but then, of course, Islam in a very different way, because in Ibn Battuta's time, it wasn't sort of it never tried to be a colonial movement, of course, but it was a very powerful cultural engine for transformation, and it did affect a lot of the world. And you get things like, the extraordinary story where he meets a sort of Amazon princess. And it's somewhere around here, just Southeast Asia. Nobody really knows exactly where it is. I suspect it might have been in Borneo, but she's not Muslim, but she can speak a bit of Turkish and she can write in Arabic. And, she actually says to somebody, bring a pen and paper, and she writes, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful, in beautiful Arabic script. So, I've wondered about her a lot. But if you look at, I suspect she was part of what's called the Majapahit Empire, which was centered on sort of Java, Sumatra, but had a great seaborne influence. And you do find these surviving amulets, which have Hindu deities on one side. They're like little coins. And on the other side, they have the Basmala, the Islamic, in the name of God. Yeah. So, there was a lot of sort of overlap, but in a very organic way. I think in what we think of as the colonial period, from late 15th century on, it was more a question of imposition, whereas in Ibn Battuta's time, it was a question of permeation. Does that word exist? Influences going through and meeting each other and mingling in a much sort of gentler way.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the terms permeation versus imposition that you chose to describe the dominant flavor of those eras makes a perfect sense for pre- and post-colonization periods. At this point, I would like to once again touch upon the travels of Ibn Battuta. We know that the traveler is commonly known as a rihla, and rihla is a genre. What does the word mean literally? And what genre does rihla represent in Islamic literature?
Rihla, I suppose it simply means a journey. It's a journey as opposed to a staying in a place. And there are various cognate words that for camels. A lot comes down to camels in Arabic. So it's about going on a journey, and it's as simple as that, really. In Arabic literature, there are quite a lot of rihlas, and a lot of them are actually quite sort of, how can I put it? They're very worthy books, but they're not always very
attractive.
No, they are. If you are sort of a scholar of hadith, of the sayings and doings of Prophet Muhammad, and people would go on journeys to collect his sayings and doings, and they would write books which are called rihla, which are effectively going around and picking up hadiths, meeting other scholars and discussing with them, but they're quite, to us, I suppose today, they're quite abstruse. They're quite a sort of rarefied form of literature. So that was really what people thought of, even in Ibn Battuta's time, when you talked about a and it was why his contemporaries didn't think very much of his. His is it's not well enough written. It's all about these outlandish places. But it's also drawing on an old history of descriptive geography. Things like Accounts of China and India, which is the earliest Arabic travel book. I've edited and translated that, but also there are other books like that, The Wonders of India. But there are also other rihlas a bit like Ibn Battuta's, And the very best one is by somebody called Ibn Jubayr, who was a Spanish writer. I think he was originally from Valencia, I think. But he went on the pilgrimage to Mecca and wrote a fascinating book about his experiences and adventures on the way, and sort of passed through Roman-ruled Sicily and Palestine when the fighting was going on, and with the Crusaders. So, and that is an absolutely fascinating book. And I must say, it's wonderfully well written. And Ibn Battuta actually lifts quite a lot from that book, and usually acknowledges.
In that respect, we can say that who is interested in Ibn Battuta should put Ibn Jubayr's Rihla on to read on their to read list.
Definitely, yeah. Read Ibn Jubayr. And another favorite of mine is Al-Abdari, who was a Moroccan like Ibn Battuta. And his is more a kind of traditional, meeting the scholars and discussing the hadith. But he was a kind of quite a sort of, I want to say, choleric person. He got quite angry and wound up about things. So, he criticizes everyone. And it's a very good read.
Maybe we can say as opposed to Ibn Battuta, who has a very cool character. Here, Tim, I'm so excited to explore more about Ibn Battuta himself. And for that purpose, maybe it would be a good idea to listen to the opening passage of the Travelogue to see what information is embedded there.
My departure from Tangier, my birthplace, took place on Thursday, the 2nd of the month of God, Rajab the Unique, in the year 725, with the object of making the pilgrimage to the Holy House at Mecca, and of visiting the tomb of the Prophet, God's richest blessing and peace be upon him, at Medina. I set out alone, having neither fellow traveller in whose companionship I might find cheer, nor caravan whose party I might join, but swayed by an overmastering impulse within me, and a desire long cherished in my bosom to visit these illustrious sanctuaries. So I braced my resolution to quit all my dear ones, female and male, and forsook my home as birds forsake their nests. My parents being yet in the bonds of life, it weighed sorely upon me to part from them, and both they and I were afflicted with sorrow at this separation. My age at that time was 22 years.
We'll listen to the beautiful opening passage of the Travels of Ibn Battuta, which reveals few bits of information about him and the purpose of his travels for us. Ibn Battuta was a Moroccan traveler who departed his hometown, Tangier, in the farthest realms of Africa for 29 years of traveling at the age of 25 in year 1329. What else we know about Ibn Battuta and his background? For example, his ethnicity, socio-economic status, faith, and family.
Yeah, we don't know a huge amount other than what he tells us in his travels. And what he tells us is that he came from a family of fuqaha, jurists, faqirs in Morocco. So they were jurists or jurisprudence, and they were experts in the fiqh, the legal school of Malik ibn Anas, and it was the predominant one in Morocco. Yeah. So that was his background, and his family would have been jurists and judges and things like that. I think I found an Ibn Battuta in Spain I think he's mentioned in one of the big books in Spain about the same time as being a judge. They weren't a sort of famous family. They were probably quite well to do, but what you would call sort of middle class. Interestingly, they were ethnically, I suppose, they were
Amazigh?
They were Amazigh, really, yes. And he's usually billed as being from Lewata, which is an Amazigh tribe, but he he sometimes calls himself Jarawi. I'm not sure of the Amazigh pronunciation, but that's another kind of related tribe. But they were ethnically Amazigh, if you like, native North African, but very, very much Arabicized. And, to all intents and purposes, he was part of Arabdom. It's who is an Arab is a very interesting question. I've written a big, thick book about it. But basically, if you subscribe to the language and the culture, you're Arab. You're Arab. So, to all intents and purposes, he was Arab, although his roots were in the Amazighs.
So Ibn Battuta was from one of the Arabized Amazigh tribes of North Africa. Now, I would like to be benefited from your language knowledge. You can read Arabic, and it would be fantastic if you can read out for us the opening passage of the travelogue, which we just listened to the English translation in the original language, Arabic, if you don't mind.
It's a very moving passage, and I was going to say in its simplicity. It's not entirely simple because it's written partly in rhyming prose. I'm always moved by the fact that he, as you read very beautifully, that he said he quit his loved ones, female and male, and he put in Arabic grammar. You don't have to say that because if you say my loved ones, al-ahbab, covering both female and male, but he actually said it specifically, and he put the females before the males. And I think, he was, some people have called him a womanizer, which is a bit unfair, but he was very fond of women. And, in all senses of the word. And, he obviously was heartbroken to leave his family as a whole. And but at the same time, you might say that he put the women first to get the males second, to get the rhyme in the Arabic. I will try to read it. كان خروجي من طنجة مسقط راسي في يوم الخميس الثاني من شهر الله رجب الفرد عام 25 و700 معتمدا حج بيت الله الحرام وزيارة قبر الرسول عليه أفضل الصلاة والسلام منفردا عن رفيق آنس بصحبتي وراكب أكون في جملتي بباعث على النفس شديد العزائم وشوق إلى تلك المعاهد الشريفة كامنا في الحيازم فحزمت عمري على هجر الأحباب من الإناث والذكور وفارقت وطني مفارقة طيوري للبكور وكان والداي بقيد الحياة فتحملت لبعدهما وصبا ولقيت كما لقي من الفراق نصبا وسني يومئذ 22 سنة.
Wow, it's beautiful. Thank you very much.
It is beautiful. And particularly that phrase where he says that he left his ahbab, his beloved ones, and al-inathi was the poor, and then he left the country as mufaragat tuyuri lil-wukur, as birds leave their nests.
The language sounds so poetic, and what catch my ears is the word munfaridan, which means alone and with no companion.
Yeah. And it picks up, he's already prepared us for it in a sort of literary sense, because he calls Rajab, Shahar Rajab al-Fard, Rajab the unique, and he's Munfarid. I mean, it could just be a coincidence.
A poetic coincidence, I can say. I think this can be a good finishing for our talk today. Very hopeful we can sit with you on another amazing conversation and continue our exploration in the wonderful world of Ibn Battuta. Thank you, team, for being our guest today, and thank you everyone for listening to Oriental Journeys. Our editor and creative consultant is Kate O'Connell. Aydogan Kars and Ashkan Bahrani are our content advisors from Monash University. Frank Joachim reads the passages from the Travels of Ibn Battuta. The reading passages are selected from the English translation of Rihla, The Travels of Ibn Battuta, translated by Hamilton Gibb, published by Hakloi Society. The music was composed by Ali Koegin, and Hamid Mohebbi is our sound engineer.